Candy is a huge topic. It is so popular today, but the question is, what was candy like 250 years ago? What was candy like in colonial America? Candy today is popular during the holidays. We have different kinds of candy that we use for different holidays. It's a very seasonal thing. Candy was seasonal in the 18th century as well, but not for the same kinds of reason. Possibly because of particular holidays, but more likely because of the seasonality of the ingredients that the confectioner had access to at a particular time of year. There were very seasonal times for fruits and other ingredients that would come in so that the confectioner could make his products. The roots of candy are much deeper than the 18th century. It goes back hundreds of years before that, and it really lies in two main categories. Candy comes from medicine and it comes from food preservation. They had several different ways to deliver medicines with this sugary preparation. They might make little sugar pills or lozenges, or they might put the medicine in a sweet syrup, or they had a medicine category called electuaries. And electuaries, it's based on the Greek word to lick. So it's sort of like a medicinal lollipop, except it wasn't a hard candy and it probably wasn't on a stick. Maybe like a medicinal slowpoke. So what starts out as a medicine slowly turns into recreational food. Even some of the very medicinal flavors becomes a flavor that people desire. So what starts out as medicine turns into just straight up candy. One of the great examples of that is gingerbread. So gingerbread starts off as, well, not something like we would think of as gingerbread. It's almost like let's say a sweet, sugary, very spicy little piece of asphalt, kind of very chewy and thick and gooey. That is very medicinal, say 300 or 400 years ago, and then becomes a treat. We don't use it as medicine today, certainly. Now this explains candy. This is actually in the history of drugs, written in the French, translated to English in the 18th century, and it's called Of Sugar Plums. Now remember, this is in a book about medicines. It says, there are an infinite variety of flowers, seeds, berries, kernels, plums, and the like, which are by the confectioners covered with sugar and bear the name sugar plums. And let me go down further here. It says, in the shops there are caraway confects, coriander, nonpareils, which is nothing but Orion powder covered with sugar, and what is much in vogue in Paris, green anise. Besides these, we have almond confects, chocolate, coffee, barberries, pistachio nuts, etc., orange chips and flowers, orange peel, cinnamon cloves, and many other roots, barks, fruits, flowers that are too numerous to speak of. That's what you're going to see in the confectioner's shop of the 18th century. And why is it talked about here in a book about the history of drugs? Because that's where the origins of so many of these come from. Another place where the origins of candy lie is in the realm of food preservation. How do we bring fruits, nuts, and vegetables out of season and into the future when we want to eat them, say in the winter or at a time when they wouldn't be normally available? There are many different ways to preserve food, but drying is one of the main ones. We're trying to pull all the moisture out of a food item. And fruit is the perfect example of that. If we can dry the fruit, we pull the moisture out and the sugars are left, and the other parts of the fruit, the flavors and probably a lot of the nutrients are left over. That high sugar concentration keeps them from rotting. If we just leave them on the ground, we don't really get access to pulling the moisture out, they will go bad very rapidly. And if we want to, say, increase its ability to be preserved, we add sugar to it. We increase that. So high concentrations of sugar keep these things from going bad. Something like just pure honey will stay good for a very, very long time because it's got a low moisture content and a high sugar content. So a lot of what the confectioner is doing in our time period is drying things, adding sugar to things. They're doing a lot of boiling sugar, pulling the moisture out of all these items so that they can last a great deal of time. And what we end up with is lots and lots of sweets. The preservation of citrus fruit usually happens for the confectioner in the 18th century during January and February, the season when that fruit comes in fresh to the people in Europe or say North America. So how are we going to preserve these fruits into the entire year? What happens if we want that wonderful lemony flavor in July? So there are many different ways to preserve our citrus fruit. They preserve them whole and in slices, but one of the ways you find most often, especially used in recipes, but you could also just eat it as candy, and that is candied peel. So they would make candied lime peel, candied lemon peel, and of course, candied orange peel. We're going to be doing a few candy recipes today. We'll start off with candied citrus peel, which is a recipe that we've done on the channel before, and it is so very easy and very tasty. So here is a period recipe for candied orange peel. Soak Seville orange peel in several waters till it loses its bitterness. Then boil it in a solution of double refined sugar in water until it becomes tender and transparent. That's all the real recipe is. It is very easy. We're just going to slice these guys up, take out any of that internal part of the citrus. I mean, really, that's what we think of when we're going to eat an orange or a lime or whatever. And that part we do not want for our recipe. We just want the peel, even that bitter white inner part of the peel. Once those are separated, we're going to soak this in water. Now, some recipes from the time period say to soak it up to 5 days, sometimes even in a little bit of salt water. You don't really have to go that far with it. I would say soak it 1 or 2 days if you have the time. If you don't, you will end up with a little bitterness in your peel. Not the worst thing in the world. Once the peels are soaked, then we just put them in a solution of probably about 50% water, 50% sugar. We're going to boil those or simmer them until they become transparent. And that will take maybe an hour or so, really depends on how long you've soaked your peels before. And once they are transparent, we'll take them out and lay them on a bed of sugar and sprinkle sugar over the top of them. Then they can be stored or used right away. These candied peels look great. The colors kind of pop out. They're a colorful kind of candy, and they would be used in a lot of recipes in the time period if you're doing one of those great cakes, or maybe if you're making a pudding for Christmas time, this might be in it, but you can eat them just the way they are. So let's try one of this. Here's the lemon. Just great lemon flavor. Even though these have been soaking long enough to get the bitterness out, you would think that you would lose all the lemon flavor. It is all right there. Something you can enjoy 6 months after the lemons are no longer in the market. How about orange? Again, perfect orange flavor. The limes, they can be a little more bitter sometimes. These even turned out perfect. These are great. Today, when we think about candy, probably more than 50% of the items that we would kind of put out on the table as candy would be chocolate. Well, chocolate exists in the 18th century, but it's generally not as much of a candy, and certainly not the kind of candies, chocolate candies, that we would think about today. Chocolate comes into Europe in the late 17th century, let's say 1670 or so, and it's mostly a hot drink. It's competing with tea and coffee. And of course, you put a little sugar in there to make it, nice, because it's kind of bitter all by itself. It turns into a little bit of a candy in the 18th century, and we're gonna try our hand at a chocolate candy called chocolate puffs. While chocolate recipes are not as popular as certainly they are today, there were some chocolate recipes. In Mrs. Eel's recipe book for confectionery, she has a recipe for chocolate puffs. In fact, several different puffs recipes, and we're going to take a couple of these recipes, kind of whir them up together, and we are going to make chocolate puffs. These chocolate puffs are very interesting. They're very easy, but they do have an ingredient that is not in most people's common kitchens if you go looking for it. So we will be using an ingredient called tragacanth, or in the time period it was called gum dragon, or sometimes in the recipes just dragon. That's all it was called. And it's a natural gum that you get from plants, definitely is imported, and it's very edible. We're gonna take this gum dragon, I've ground it up and then added water to it. So now it's this sort of gel-like material, a gum. This recipe is very simple. We're just gonna take sugar, and I'm gonna take some of our period chocolate here. We're gonna grind that up until it's a fine powder, add in enough of that gum to make a stiff paste. Once that's in a stiff paste, we'll make little balls, put that on a cookie sheet, and then put it in a cool oven, as she says, probably about 275 degrees, and let them set there about 20 or 30 minutes, and then our chocolate puffs will be done. When I was testing out this puff recipe, I did the lemon puffs. This is just lemon zest and sugar and the gum dragon. And I would have thought that would have made a very hard little pill. And if you would just leave it dry, that's exactly what you would get. But putting it into the oven, and this got put in the oven about 275 for 20 or 30 minutes, they actually start to grow, which I don't know why they do that, but they certainly do that. And the texture is completely different. It isn't a hard pill to eat. So let's try one of these chocolate ones. And you got chocolate flavor. They've puffed up, and you get a little bit of crunch on the outside, a little kind of sugary flavor, and then a little bit of chew on the inside. Maybe if we bake them a little bit longer, they would be crisp all the way through, but not a hard, dense thing that you have to suck on, but something that crunches up in your mouth. It's really kind of a fun thing to make, and they're very, very tasty. The lemon ones are great, and these chocolate ones are great too. This next recipe is so very simple. It's got very few ingredients. The recipe is just a couple of lines. It's called barley sugar, and what it is it's hard candy. So hard candy was very popular in the time period. It is one of those medicinal candies. You can put medicine in here if you want to, but barley sugar in the 18th century has no real flavoring. It's just a hard sugar candy. Here is the recipe for barley sugar from the Court and Country Cook. This is 1702. This is a very early recipe. It's in the confectionery section. Having caused barley to be well boiled in water, strain it through a hair sieve and let this decoction be put into clarified sugar and brought to the caramel or last degree of boiling. Then remove it from the fire till the boiling settles. Pour your barley sugar upon a marble stone rubbed with the oil of olives, taking care to hinder it from running down. If the marble be wanting, a silver dish or one of some other sort of material may be used for the same purpose. So that the sugar cools and it begins to grow hard, it must be cut into pieces and rolled out what length you please in order to be kept for use. Hard candies today are made with a very small number of ingredients also. Uses regular granulated sugar. It would use corn syrup in the place of the barley, and then you would add whatever coloring or flavoring you want into your hard candy, along with a little bit of water, obviously. Now, corn syrup isn't something that was available in the 18th century. That's really a 19th century thing, so barley is used in its place. And the reason why we're using corn syrup is because it's got an inverted sugar. So it's got glucose and fructose in it instead of sucrose. The sucrose alone will crystallize improperly. So we want to make a nice solid hard candy. We add these inverted sugars and that holds off the crystallization. This barley, when we boil it, we'll have the water left over and we'll strain that out. And that water has fiber in it and some other nutrients, but it also has a 50-50 mix of glucose and fructose. So I don't know how they figured it out in the 18th century and before that, but they had exactly the right ingredients in the barley sugar. All we need is barley, water, and sugar for this recipe. I've got 2 quarts of water in the pan here, and I'm just gonna add in 10 ounces, maybe 12 ounces of pearled barley. And we're gonna bring that up to a boil and let it simmer for about a half hour. And that barley is going to swell up and basically absorb a lot of that water. Once that's all cooked up, we're going to strain out the barley from the barley water that's left over. Now, this barley that's been cooked here is great for something like a beef and barley soup. So save that barley and use it in another recipe. But in this particular recipe, we don't need it. So basically, we're gonna throw it out. I wanna go ahead and put our barley water through a cloth and strain as much of the solids out as possible, because if we have those in there, it's likely to burn in the pan. That's another one of the tricky parts of this particular recipe. Once that barley water is strained out, we're going to put it back in our pan and add in as much sugar as we can get to dissolve into it. We're going to put this on a low heat and start to dissolve that sugar into it. And when we feel like we have enough, and it doesn't have to be very, very precise here, we are just going to put that onto a low heat and start to get it boiling. And basically, we're just going to keep heating this until we get it up to the proper heat. All of the confectionery books in the 18th century start off with boiling sugar, and they talk about the stages of boiling sugar, and this is really important in this particular recipe. They didn't have candy thermometers to tell them exactly what temperature to stop at. They would look at the candy, they put a little stick in it or a spoon in it, and they would dip it out at various stages to see what would happen with the sugar. So it starts off and we get at about, say, 230 degrees, we get the thread stage, where it gets very, very stringy. And then we keep cooking it and we keep boiling it, and then we'll get to the softball stage and a hardball stage. And we get to a soft crack and a hard crack. And the last stage we get to is called caramel in the 18th century. And that is way up there, close to 300 degrees, at least today. This recipe, even though they say to the last boiling, we're not going to go quite that far, because if you do, you get a very kind of burnt flavor. So we're going to keep boiling this until we get to just the right stage. Our barley sugar has solidified, it's cooled off on our marble slab. And one of the things that they did with this is, before it completely hardened, they would sort of pull it out into straws. This is kind of difficult to do, because what happens is it hardens around the outside edge, it's still soft in the middle, and it's hard to draw out into these straws. I don't know how they did it in the time period, and it's much easier to just score it like this and then wait for it to get cool. Then you can peel it off of here and it will break naturally at these little scored lines. And then we have these little hard candies. Here's our barley sugar of the 18th century. What does it taste like? That's the real question. And it's got the right color. They talk about it having this sort of amber color. While it's cooking, you can just start to smell the sugar burning a little bit, that caramelized kind of smell in the air, which is good until it gets too far and then it smells burnt. But this is just right. It's got the right kind of hard candy texture to it. It just carries along a wonderful caramel flavor, and that's it. There's no sort of flavoring to it. Today, we might add all kinds of crazy strawberry flavor or whatever, but in this one, it just carries along a caramel flavor, and they're really good. This recipe is something a little different. You won't find it in the standard candy shop today. It's in Mrs. Eel's cookbook and in multiple other ones. It's called clear cakes, and they come in lots of different flavors. We're going to be doing a raspberry clear cake. And clear cakes are basically a super thick jelly. You can think of it as like a version of fruit leather, but in a sort of a big chunk. Something like that. So what we're gonna do is boil our berries in some water for about 15 or 20 minutes until it's released all the juices. And then we can start to really turn it into the thick version of what we're looking for. After boiling our berries, we're going to squeeze out all the juice. We don't want any of the solids in this. They're called clear cakes, so we should be able to see right through them. Once we have our juice, we will add sugar to that and get that all dissolved. Then we're going to add in pectin. Now, the original recipe in Mrs. Eel's uses currants for the pectin. She basically boils the berries and the currants at the same time. And these aren't Zante currants, these are the currants that grow on bushes. They have a very high pectin amount to them. And the pectin is what really gels in jelly. Now, currants are really hard to get these days. I don't have access to any white currants right now, so we are going to be using the pectin that you get from apples. So you can take apples, especially green apples or crab apples, you cube them up into little pieces, you boil them in water for about 40 minutes or so, and then you strain out the apples and you keep the juice that's left over. That's got a high concentration of pectin. We'll take that pectin, and today you can just buy liquid pectin in a package and add that to what basically is raspberry jelly. And that is going to create a very, very thick jelly. In the recipe, she talks about pouring this into little molds. And then once it gels up, you turn it out of the mold and you sort of set them on glass or set them on the serving container. You can even sprinkle a little sugar on them to keep them from sticking. And those are basically a kind of a real soft candy. Our raspberry clear cakes are now out of the form, so you have to let them cool off for quite a while and gel up. That's the whole point. They're supposed to be a super thick jelly. And certainly these are that. They remind me of, you know, a gumdrop or something that we would have today, at least in their shape. And these have a nice clear color to them. You can see light through them. They're beautiful red raspberry color. And you do need to cover them with sugar so you can pick them up and handle them without them sticking to your finger, because they are very sticky. They call for sort of letting them air out, and I think she just means cool off. Maybe she means to actually dry them so they become even more thick. I don't know, but let's try them out just like this. And a wonderful thick jelly flavor and texture. They're super good, very, very sugary, obviously, but a lot of fruit flavor in there. So this is just basically two fruits mixed together. We have the apple pectin, we have, which really doesn't bring any flavor with it, but just the gel, and then the wonderful raspberry flavor, along with lots of sugar, and a very, very simple thing to make, and very tasty. Candy has a fascinating history, hundreds of years old, and we can engage and experiment with it ourselves. We can make these wonderful candies. Some of them are so simple, so tasty, and we can also try out and really eat almost exactly the same things they thought were candy in the time period. We have lots of dried fruits and candied fruits available to us today, and it's so good and so historical.